If someone were going to give a eulogy about you today, what do you hope that they would say? What personality traits or accomplishments do you hope to be remembered for? What stories do you hope that people will tell at your funeral? The answers to these questions will be varied. Consider the wonderful diversity of people we remembered in this year's In Memoriam. Each one of them brought particular gifts to the community. One person might be remembered for their gentleness and love of animals. Another for always asking the questions that were on everybody's mind, but no one dared to voice. And yet another for the work of their hands and the beautiful things they built. We remember how one person had this amazing ability to remember details about other people and inquire after them. And another person is remembered for their work in the community and how they pursued justice with determination in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable, but often helped to make the world a better place. It is possible, I suppose, that we might want our loved ones to remember us for our fancy car, or the size of our bank account, or the important job we had. But I don't think that's a very common wish. Who really wants someone to stand up at their funeral and say they had lots and lots of money, but no one liked them, and they never helped anyone with it? Most of us want to be remembered for the positive impact we had on the lives of others. And those are generally the things that people actually do remember. I've never heard anyone say, "I remember my grandfather with fondness because he was a very wealthy man." I have often heard people say things like, "My grandmother was such a thoughtful person. She took her time to arrive at an opinion about things, but when she did, people stopped to listen." Or, "I wish I had my father's knack with mechanical things. He just seemed to have a sense of what was wrong and how to fix it." Or, "My neighbor had always a kind word for everyone. When he asked after your family, you knew he really wanted you to actually answer the question because he cared." What people remember, the legacy that we leave, is the impact we have on someone else's living and the world around us. In our Bible story from the last chapter of Genesis, we find Joseph's brothers pondering their father's death, and then we hear about Joseph's own death. But before we can consider both those matters, we need to back up a little place in the story. So let's jump back to the time when Joseph was 17. Joseph is a spoiled teenager whose father dotes on him and his younger brother Benjamin. Joseph's 10 older brothers are not happy about this arrangement, and it's not really surprising that they resent Joseph. Not only does he get the best of his father's attention and fancy presents, but he's also a little bit full of himself and doesn't treat his brothers with much kindness. Of course, none of that justifies what comes next in the story. Because one day when Joseph is heading out to the fields to find his brothers where they are tending the family sheep, his brothers hatch a plot against him. And when he arrives, they attack him, take away the fancy coat their father gave him, and throw him in a pit. Then some slave traders happen by and they sell their brother into slavery. They take the fancy robe and they kill a goat and they dip the robe in blood, taking it to their father to convince him that his favorite son is dead. Then, if we zip forward quite a few years, Joseph has a bunch of ups and downs in Egypt before eventually rising to be Pharaoh's supply manager. He's still a slave, but he's an important slave now. And at the same time, back in Canaan, where his brothers and his dad live, there's an enormous famine. So eventually Jacob sends his other sons to Egypt to see if there's any food to be purchased. And they meet up again with Joseph, but they don't recognize him. And Joseph designs a test for them to see if the evil they did to him is still in their hearts. And when they pass, they are reconciled and they bring Jacob to Egypt where there is food. So that takes us to this point. Now Jacob has died and his sons take him back to Canaan to bury him. And when they get back to Egypt after the burial, The brothers are a little bit worried that Joseph might want to take revenge for the evil they did him. They're worried that it was just for the sake of their father that they forestalled that. And so they come to Joseph, and once again they beg his forgiveness, offering to be his attendants or slaves. Joseph replies that God has brought good out of a situation where they intended evil, and reassures them that they don't have to be afraid because he will take care of them and their children. In effect, Joseph chooses what kind of legacy he will leave. Rather than holding a grudge and nursing family resentments, Joseph chooses grace. Just like he did when they first came towards him looking for food, in the wake of their father's death, Joseph once again chooses to forgive his brothers and commits to protecting and caring for his brothers' families as well. This choice brings Joseph peace. Genesis has perhaps what is one of the happiest endings in all of Scripture. Joseph remained in Egypt with his father's family. He lived to be 110. He held his great-grandchildren on his knee. And when he is dying, his family promises that when the time comes for them to go back to Canaan, they will take his bones with them. In the meantime, he dies peacefully at 110, is embalmed and put in a sarcophagus in Egypt. In Bible speak, that's about as close as you ever get to they lived happily ever after. And I wonder how the story would have ended differently if Joseph had made other choices. What if he had been so busy stewing on resentment for the unfair treatment that he had received? And we all have to agree that being sold into slavery is unfair for being a stuck-up 17-year-old. What if he had nursed the resentments that happened when he was in Egypt, when he encountered all kinds of other unfairness? Would he have been able to foresee the drought and the need to save food and to save so many lives if he had been busy being angry about all of that? How many people would have starved? And what if he had recognized his brothers and had them thrown in jail when they arrived in Egypt looking for food, rather than testing to see if they had had a change of heart? Would he have ever been reunited with his father? How would he have felt if he learned that his father starved in Canaan? And would he have felt good about seeing his brothers in jail, even though they surely deserved that? The choices we make influence the legacy that we leave. Joseph definitely had reasons to be resentful and bitter, yet that is not the path he chooses. Maybe if he chose bitterness or resentment, we wouldn't remember him at all. He wouldn't have found his way into the book of Scripture. But instead, he is the hero of the last half of the book of Genesis. And we too must make choices that influence the kind of legacy we leave. What do we invest our time and energy in? What values and priorities guide our living? How do we keep going after we've suffered setbacks and losses? How do we heal relationships that have become strained or broken? Do we nurture resentment or choose grace? For most of us, these kinds of choices won't involve our brothers kneeling at our feet begging forgiveness for selling us into slavery. They will come at ordinary moments when we make everyday choices about the kind of life we want to live, and therefore the kind of legacy we want to leave for those who will come after us. May God grant us the wisdom as we make those choices. Thanks be to God.